June 11, 2024, Bonne Terre, Missouri. David Hosier, a 69-year-old man with a failing heart, was executed despite no DNA, no fingerprints, and no eyewitnesses linking him to the crime. No appeals left, no last-minute call, no way out, just a conviction the state never took back. He had spent over a decade on death row, maintaining his innocence until the very end. And on his final day, as the clock counted down, he was given one last chance to speak. What he said in those final moments, and the way he faced a day that had no tomorrow, is something you won't forget. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs to a final morning, and June 11, 2024 carried all of it. David Hosier woke up that day at the Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri, knowing with complete certainty what the evening held for him. Clemency had been denied the night before. No further appeals were being pursued. The roads that had taken years to travel had all ended at the same wall, and David Hosier was sitting quietly behind it, waiting for the hours to pass. He was 69 years old that morning, and his body had been failing him for weeks. Just a month before his execution date, he had been taken from the prison to a hospital, a rare move for a death row inmate, where he was diagnosed with atrial fibrillation. His sister had spoken to the press about how his health had collapsed in that final week, describing leg swelling and severe pain on top of the heart condition. He wheezed when he spoke. His voice had grown weak. The man who had once served in the U.S. Navy with top-secret clearance, who had worked as a firefighter and EMT in Jefferson City, was now barely strong enough to hold a conversation, and the state of Missouri had his execution scheduled for that evening regardless. His spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood, had been walking alongside him through those final days and would later describe what it felt like to guide someone through the very last moments of their life. What he revealed about David Hosier's state of mind on June 11th is not what most people would expect, because the man sitting in that cell was not who the court documents made him out to be. And what his life had actually looked like before everything collapsed is the part of this story that the trial never fully let the world see. Before June 11th, 2024, David Hosier had been many things the headlines never made room for. He had lost his father, an Indiana State Police sergeant, to a violent crime when David was just a teenager, a wound his defense team argued had quietly shaped the course of everything that followed. He enrolled in military school after that loss, served 4 years in active duty with the U.S. Navy, earned an honorable discharge, and then became a firefighter and EMT in Jefferson County. A man who spent years running toward emergencies, toward people who needed saving, toward situations most people instinctively run the other way from. But none of that followed him into the courtroom. What followed him instead were the years of mental illness, a diagnosis of depression with psychotic features and bipolar disorder after an involuntary hospitalization in 1987, a stroke in the late 2000s that his attorney said caused lasting brain damage, and a medical history his original trial lawyers, according to appellate filings, never fully placed before the jury. 2 U.S. representatives, Cori Bush and Emanuel Cleaver, had written directly to Governor Parson in the days before June 11th, urging him to consider the evidence that was never heard at trial and pointing out that a Menin heart failure posed no threat to anyone. The governor disagreed. Hosier himself had always wanted the focus placed somewhere else, on the absence of physical evidence. No confession, no eyewitnesses, no fingerprints, no DNA found at the scene. Those were the facts he had leaned on for 15 years. Authorities maintained throughout the process that the conviction was legally sound. But for David Hosier, not a single piece of physical evidence had ever connected him to that crime, and that was the thing he could never let go of, right up until the end. But then something happened that almost no one expected, something the state of Missouri had to specifically accommodate on the day of his execution, a detail about his physical condition that almost no outlet reported, and that changes the way you see everything about how that final evening actually unfolded. By the afternoon of June 11th, the process surrounding an execution had begun moving with a kind of quiet precision that makes the whole thing feel almost unreal. No emergency filings, no last-minute calls between legal teams, no frantic anything. His attorney, Larry Comp, had said plainly the day before that no court appeals were pending. That door was closed. The governor had closed the other one. The afternoon moved the only way it could, steadily, indifferently, toward the hour that had been written on the calendar since February. In one of his final interviews with the Associated Press, Hosier had said he was frustrated, not just with the outcome, but with how his clemency petition had been framed. He felt it should have focused more on the lack of physical evidence rather than the story of his personal life. He had maintained his innocence from the day of his arrest, through every appeal, through every rejection, and he was still maintaining it as that afternoon moved forward. For the state, the matter had been reviewed and decided. For David Hosier, the question of what the evidence actually proved had never been truly answered, and he carried that into the final hours. And in that moment, as the afternoon gave way to evening and the witnesses were being prepared, everything came down to a few final words. What the prison had done differently for his execution because of his broken body, and what David Hosier chose to say when he was given the floor for the very last time, is where this story finds its most painful and human corner. Because of his deteriorating health, the heart condition, the physical fragility, the weeks of illness that had preceded that day, the execution procedure in Hosier's case was carried out with specific amendments. A local anesthetic was administered before the lethal injection to accommodate his medical state. A 69-year-old man with atrial fibrillation, swollen legs, documented brain damage from a stroke, and a voice too weak to carry across a room, the state adjusted its procedure for his broken body and then carried the sentence out anyway. That detail is not easy to sit with, no matter where a person stands on this case. His final hours were spent with family and with Reverend Hood, who had served as his spiritual guide through the last chapter of his life. Hood later told the press that Hosier was resigned, that he had accepted what was coming. There is a particular tenderness that forms between a person and their spiritual advisor in a place like death row, a bond built entirely inside circumstances most people will never face. Hood had been walking that road alongside David Hosier for a long time, and on June 11th, he was there for the last steps of it. The goodbyes that passed between Hosier and the people who loved him in those hours belonged to them, but the weight of them belongs to anyone willing to stop and feel it for a moment. A father, a brother, a man who had once run into burning buildings to save strangers, saying goodbye for the very last time, and then the clock reached the hour. Witnesses were in the room. The procedure had been amended and prepared, and David Hosier was given the one thing no court or petition had ever truly given him, a moment to speak uninterrupted with no one left to argue against him. What he chose to say in that room, with nothing left to fight for and no tomorrow left to protect, is the part of the story that lands different line every single person who hears it. David Hosier did not go silently. In his final statement, he held the same position he had maintained for 15 years, that he was innocent of the crimes for which Missouri had condemned him. He had said it to every court, every appeals board, and every journalist who had ever sat across from him in that prison. And he said it one last time in that room. But alongside his declaration of innocence, he said something that shifted the entire weight of the moment. He expressed his love for his family and for all the people he cared about, and the very last words he would ever speak. A man who had spent over a decade in one of the loneliest places on earth turned not toward anger, not toward the system, not toward 15 years of closed doors, but toward love. That is the man who was pronounced dead at 6:11 p.m. on June 11, 2024 in Bonne Terre, Missouri. He was 69 years old. There are people who will carry that Tuesday in June for the rest of their lives. His son and daughter, who watched their father fight a system that kept closing its doors on him. His sister, who told the world about his failing health and then watched everything proceed anyway. Reverend Hood, who walked him through those final moments and had to carry that back into the world alone. The families of Angela and Rodney Gilpin, whose grief began in September 2009 and was never simple, regardless of what any verdict declared. David Hosier had been a teenager who lost his father to violence, a sailor, a firefighter, a man whose medical history and mental illness were, according to his own appellate lawyers, never fully heard by the jury that sentenced him to death. Whether the courts handled his case the way they should have, whether the evidence was enough, whether justice looked the way it was supposed to look, those are questions different people will keep answering differently for a long time. What is not a question is the grief of his final day, a morning with no way out, an afternoon moving toward an hour no one could stop, a final statement that ended not in bitterness, but in love, and a silence that settled over Bonne Terre, Missouri, at 6:11 p.m. on a Tuesday in June, when the day that had no tomorrow finally came to its end. Whether the system got it right or not, one question still remains. Was justice truly served?